Hey everybody. It came from New Jersey, episode 1. This is our first official episode. We had an episode before this. It was just kind of an introduction, episode 0, just giving you kind of insight into what Bob and I are going to be talking about. Bob, what's going on?
Not much, Pete. Thanks for doing the preamble. I appreciate it. And so if you didn't get a chance to listen to our episode 0 and introduce ourselves, talk about the general gist of this, this is a music podcast about music that maybe you could have guessed from the name came from New Jersey. There's a lot of it and a lot of different stuff. And Pete, what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to be talking about the Gaslight Anthem album called The 59 Sound, which we chose, I think, because, it's in both of our wheelhouses. It's, familiar territory for both of us, but it's also something that neither of us were familiar with at all. So, I think, we thought that it would make for an interesting discussion.
Absolutely. I think that it was kind of a fun jumping off point for us and a jumping on point, hopefully, for people who will be interested in this podcast. So I think that's a great place to start, is that this is, generally speaking, in a world of music that we are both familiar with. However, the record is something that neither of us had heard before, if not in the briefest, note here or there. So before we get into the whole thing, because we're going to go through, we're going to give you some information about the record, this, that, and the other. Was there anything going into this that you were most curious about?
I was most curious about how much it would align with where I come from, right? So I grew up playing punk rock music, and I knew that this kind of came from that. But I also know that they're a much bigger band than that at this point, right? They've kind of transcended the punk, underground thing, and they're playing much bigger venues and, obviously appealing to a much larger audience at this point. So I didn't really know how much crossover there would be, or, if what I was hearing would sound familiar or not.
Well, and to say what you're saying, I think is there going to be a disconnect from my experience to this one?
Right. Yeah.
I think that's probably in a curiosity way, and we'll get into kind of our presumptions later. But what I was most curious about thinking about this record was, is this for me? And that's a question that I'll kind of circle back to at some point, because there's often times when, given age or this type of stuff you're into, something can be not just competent, not just well done, not just well constructed, but doesn't feel like you're the person it's for, and that can make it kind of feel far apart. So we'll get into it, because I ended up at a very different place. So where do we want to start here, Pete?
Let's start with, I guess, where it actually came from.
Yeah, we're kind of geographic here. So where did it come from?
Yeah, so I know that Brian Fallon, I believe, grew up in Fairhaven, which is actually really close to where I grew up.
Yeah, like the town over, right?
Literally the town over, from Rumson, New Jersey. And I thought that was interesting, because that, to me, kind of adds this whole other layer of, I actually know specifically where this person grew up and what that experience is, so
right.
Outside of that, though, I mean, for me, I know that they played a lot of New Brunswick basements. I know that they kind of ran with a lot of people that I'm actually familiar with. I actually remember running into Brian Fallon, and I think around 2011, I was practicing at Red Bank rehearsal, and I was with a friend of mine who had actually toured opening up for the Gaslight Anthem at that point. And it was just interesting, because I was talking to this guy, I had no idea what his music sounded like, but knew that they were popular. He was a very nice fella. Yeah. But it's one of those things where you run in circles. Jersey is a small place, so right. Big bands, small bands. I mean, everybody has their Bruce Springsteen story. Everybody's run into him at the, workout world or whatever. So it's funny that
yeah, I think we could triangulate Bruce Springsteen's house somewhere halfway between yours and wherever Brian Fallon grew up in.
Right, I'm sure. Yeah, exactly.
And so that's an interesting thing. Red Bank Rehearsal Studio is it's infamous, I guess, for being not a great place. A lot of music's come in and out of there. So the stories of practice spaces is something that could be told for sure. In the same way,
a lot of history.
Yeah, the same way you could talk about small venues or like, the New Brunswick basements, rehearsal spaces, whether it's Red Bank Rehearsal, Hot Dog House in Asbury Park. There's a few others, especially in central and northern New Jersey, that I'm less familiar with, but it's sort of like this. It kind of circles to this theory I have, Pete, that creative circles are much smaller than people think. A friend of mine asked a question, said, "Oh, how did so-and-so get this person's phone number to call him?" And, I was like, "Oh, well, I mean, he makes music and that guy makes music. So it's probably, if it's not two steps, it might even just be one step of connection to be able to do that." And I think it's a lot more common than people know for the especially as you get older, for the connection between a small artist and larger artist to not be dramatic, so that doesn't surprise me, given the fact that you've been in bands and done music for so long, that, I sort of assumed that you would have ran in circles with at least a few of the people who ended up in this band in Gaslight Anthem. So but just for the basics, they were a New Brunswick band, for lack of a better term. Is that accurate? Are we comfortable saying that?
I don't know. Actually, I have no idea how, like
how they when it comes to,
well, in terms of like regionalism, like how they would, identify in terms of New Jersey. I feel like they're a New Jersey band, and I'm not sure how, when it comes to the specifics of where in New Jersey, like where they would land. But
okay,
that sounds right. I have no idea.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they identify as that because they did do the whole New Brunswick thing. And for someone who's listening to this podcast who's not from New Jersey, New Brunswick is a very specific place. It is, for all intents and purposes, it is the center of New Jersey. It is where Rutgers University's main campus is, which is, is it fair to say it's the largest school in New Jersey? I think it is.
I think it is, yeah.
And it's also, it's a 35, 40-minute train ride into New York City. There are a lot of young people who live there. It is a hub for commuters. It's a hub for people who are just there. Outside of the university, though, there's not an awful lot going on in New Brunswick. It's not like some shopping destination. There's some bars that are all like college bars, essentially. There's not much of, and let me be clear. If you're somebody new in New Brunswick and you think I'm totally wrong and I don't know about the new eateries, please excuse me. But historically, the place you went to eat in New Brunswick was like the what are they?
The grease trucks?
Grease trucks, there you go, which are food trucks that have been around forever that served sandwiches that had every kind of thing in it. So be like, yeah, I'm going to get the Fat Jimmy, which has 2 hamburgers, a chicken fingers, French fries, lettuce, tomato, falafel, and maybe some mozzarella sticks. So all on a sandwich for whatever, $5.
$5. You challenge your friends to eat 2 of them. You'd stay up late at night, not being able to sleep because you ate too much food.
Feeling terrible. Yeah. It's been a long time since I've had a sandwich from the grease trucks. I
don't even know that they still exist. I think they do, but they're definitely in a separate area.
Right. Yeah. It's a very different thing. So anyways, the one thing that New Brunswick has had, and I think this is a fair way to put it, is that almost out of necessity and sheer boredom and desperation, an odd underground music scene exists. And it's somewhere in between punk music, indie rock, alt rock, bands trying to make it, bands trying to get to New York, lo-fi, every kind of thing you can think of. It's essentially the AAA to Brooklyn. And it's kind of fascinating. And like, to step away from any sort of personal feelings, it's pretty cool that it exists. And, you know, the basement scene there has always been, well, always, since the 90s at the very least, has been thriving. And it's so interesting how it's evolved, because they hit the point where essentially all these basements needed to have code words and code names so that they didn't get shut down, because these were completely off the books events happening. And I know for a fact Gaslight Anthem was a band who played many of these types of gigs. So it's really cool. And I think they are, if not from New Brunswick by pure location, they were a part of that world enough so that you could call them a band from New Brunswick.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds right.
Yeah. And, you know, so before they were in Gaslight Anthem, I know that the drummer was in a band. Oh, what was it? Low End Theory.
Okay.
Who you know, is it fair to call them pop punk?
I've actually never heard them.
Oh, okay.
I know of them. I've actually never listened to them either, though.
I don't know if it's fair. Yeah. Oh man. Okay, we're gonna have to do that because I'm going on 20-year-old fumes on this one, but I vaguely remember them kind of circling in the Midtown type scene. And if I'm incorrect about that, please someone correct me. But they were there. Apparently, some of them were in a band directly before Gaslight Anthem called This Charming Man, a reference, Smith's reference, I'm assuming. So yeah, we will say they're from New Brunswick. Is there anything like you can add to that New Brunswick experience? Because that certainly shaped my initial impression of the Gaslight Anthem, and like thinking about them coming from that world sort of started putting them in this triangulation where I could say, okay, all right, I can see some of where this is coming from.
Yeah, it definitely felt relatable in that way, where I, could imagine seeing this band at a certain time. It actually made me want to, and, we'll get into the details of the album soon, but this was definitely a bigger record. It felt more produced. It felt more professional. I'm now curious actually to go back to that first album that I did not listen to,
right? Because
I feel like that would be something that would really resonate with me in the way that, like, I definitely saw bands like that, and familiar with that scene in New Brunswick at the time. I was not living in New Jersey at the time that Gaslight Anthem kind of became big and stuff. Right. So I was absent for that, but I was definitely there and very involved, right before that. So the history of it, definitely, the through line makes sense to me. I can hear it.
So I was also not living in New Jersey at this time, but I lived in New Brunswick. Man, it's starting to feel old here. But I moved out and moved to New Brunswick from the Jersey Shore when I was 19, I guess, in like 2001. And I lived there in 2002 and 2003 until I moved to California. And one of the things in doing kind of the homework for this episode and the story of this band and who they were and what their shows were like before this record and before they were kind of taking off felt super familiar, because the sound on this record, and we're going to get there in extensive detail, reminded me so much of a couple of the guys I lived with who were kind of coming from this punk world. Obviously, we're in rock bands and trying to do that, but we're trying to do something that was a little more accessible. They weren't, and it's hard to say this, they weren't trying to sell their souls to the devil to be on a major label and make a living with their guitar, but they were trying to go, but that would be kind of cool, wouldn't it? Like, if I could write music that I believed in and liked, that also paid the bills, that also meant I was rocking giant stadiums,
Right.
So there was a certain level with that I was like, I wonder how many of my ex-roommates both love this band and two, hate them because they curse their name going, that should have been me. That should have been me. And I have a feeling
there's definitely a lot of those. They might still be playing New Brunswick bars right now.
Well, so that's the other side, right? Is that so there's the New Brunswick basement scene, and there's also, and it's not like they're separate, but there's some bars, but they're not like what I would call notable places you'd want to play. They were basically like, I got this band and I'm trying to give it a go. Let's try to make this happen. And, that's a story. And it's like, let's not make New Brunswick out to be something more than it is. If you've lived in a college town or near a college town or been to a college town, it's probably a lot like that. New Brunswick has a little bit more storied history because of that whole basement thing. That's pretty neat. And maybe we'll get there sometime on like a different kind of episode. But there was a lot of young people trying to do stuff. And so that's something I've always been attracted to, because it means, hey, there's something going on here, as opposed to just, a podunk suburban town. So that's, and I think given that there weren't, before the Gaslight Anthem, it sounds like these guys were all doing music, but nothing that stuck. There was no bands that were like, oh yeah, I remember that name, or I've heard that name, or hey, that was like, the Low End Theory is the only one that I'm like, oh yeah, I know that name. Everything else was kind of like, oh, that's interesting, never heard of it. With that said, to us, from our perspective, it wasn't like this was some super group. There were not any heavy hitters coming in and like, hey, here's the new band, this was not Traveling Wilburys or what is it?
Traveling Wilburys.
Traveling Wilburys. Yeah, you can see where my brain is after teaching my 6-year-old kindergarten science today.
I will say, just to start it off, though, Gaslight Anthem might have more tracks in one album than the Traveling Wilburys had in their entire career.
Isn't it a shame that Traveling Wilburys weren't better?
It really is. Like, because I love all those dudes.
Right, same, and like a total sucker for a few of them. And even at that time period, like, of their careers, I think some of them were still doing, if not brilliant, certainly worthwhile work. And for some reason, it's like the weird math equation where two rights make a wrong.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's like it's too many good songwriters just being like, I got this throwaway track. Let's just like, I'll give it to Paul and see or give it to George and see what he can do with it, right? Like,
yeah. Who do you think?
I think they're all saving their good stuff for their own albums, which, like, that makes sense. But it's just a bummer that they couldn't collaborate and make it better.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of, that's the story of a supergroup. It's not that different than like an all-star team in sports. They're not going to get together and go, okay, guys, let's practice for 6 months. Let's work this out. Let's figure out who's going to do what. George, you're going to be quality control. When something doesn't sound good, you're going to go, nah, let's cut that. I was going to ask, who do you think ran quality control? Who was the filter in that band? And the answer is probably fucking no one.
Nobody. Yeah.
It's just, hey, do you got this song? Hey, you do one, you do this one. That riff you were doing? I was kind of messing. Oh, okay, let's all work on this one. So, all right, we're good. There we go. Call it.
Maybe. All right, I'm going to say this. Maybe Roy Orbison, because the first album is better than the second album. So.
Oh, yeah. Yes. The second album, precipitous drop off. Big
huge drop off.
And yes, and I think I agree with you that there's more tracks on this record. So,
yeah.
Before you listen to this, did you have any preconceived notions, any assumptions leading into it, whether it was about the band or the record or what it was going to sound like, or any kind of prejudices against it, or things that were like going for it, any positives? You're like, hey, I think I'm going to kind of lean into this.
So I definitely didn't think it would be like totally in my lane. I thought that it would sound like, and I think you actually mentioned this in the last episode and we agreed, but I thought it would sound like Bruce Springsteen coming from the basements of New Brunswick or something. So it was like kind of a like Darkness on the Edge of Town era Bruce, like, but with kind of a grittier feel to it. that's what I thought it would sound like, and that's kind of where I felt it ended up actually. So I feel like that was right. I didn't really expect to love it, which, I don't really think it's in my lane. It's something that I'm familiar with and that I definitely liked, but I definitely understand the appeal. Like there were songs that they definitely had hooks, and they definitely had verses and choruses that I could imagine hundreds, if not thousands, of people singing every word to. So that's definitely what I thought about it going in, and it basically proved to be exactly what I thought it would be, which is not a diss in any way. It's just, just everything I had heard about the band, kind of the image of the band that I had seen, the photos of them that I had seen, the vibe, it basically was, more or less what I expected it to be. It was the dude, they can write, or I guess it's Brian Fallon.
Sure.
The dude can write a track, I mean, he definitely knows how to put pen to paper. He definitely knows how to write a song. So, yeah. What did you think? Okay. Or what did you think going in?
My assumptions? Okay.
Yeah.
And this is a good way as people listen to kind of get to know us and think about this. I was very afraid that this record was going to be super corny.
Yeah.
I was afraid I was seeing Greaser cosplay. When I see a guy, look, if I see a person wearing a leather jacket and a white t-shirt, I am so sorry. That's where I lean. And that's a prejudice. That's a presumption that's not fair, because I have now looked at a lot of photos of Gaslight Anthem, and I don't think there's any kind of weird necessary like cosplay. I don't think they were like on some weird shit. I was like, okay, all you hear about this band is Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, if this is what everyone says, am I going to be like, I don't think so? Or is it going to be so on the nose that it doesn't appeal? Or like we've talked about, is this going to be Bruce Springsteen over Basement of New Brunswick, faux rock? And, those were some of the things I was thinking going in, fair or not. So with that, I don't know. If I hadn't, now I've heard it, but before I heard the record, I assumed that there was going to be some real lull, and that when I think of Bruce Springsteen, his hits are hits, and he's got a couple records that are great, but he also has some moments, especially in the middle of his records, where there's low energy. And I was like, I wonder if I'm gonna feel a sag in the energy. I wonder if they're gonna try to lean into this kind of the darker side of Americana, where it slows down and it's supposed to be soulful, and when it's great, it is, but when it doesn't hit the mark, it just can kind of be flat. So that was some of my worries, and I wasn't sure if they were going to do that. I wasn't sure where I was going to fall in terms of the energy on the record and as a whole. What about you?
So you're not a Lucky Town era Bruce Springsteen fan, I imagine.
No, I'm not.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I thought that there would be kind of energy throughout. I definitely know what you're saying when you say, when you talk about their look, the leather jacket, that's something that was not really attractive to me. It didn't really make me want to check them out.
And let's be real, that's not fair.
It's definitely not fair. Yeah.
But that is real. So it's worth saying. And,
listen,
to start.
Everyone chooses an aesthetic, right? So, I mean, that you as a band, you decide what you're putting out into the world.
Right.
And, that certain people are going to buy into that really quickly, and other people might take some convincing.
That's right. And some people are going to be buy it. Some people aren't going to care. Some people are going to care too much.
Yeah. I definitely think it's unfair. I think we care too much. I know that I care too much.
We definitely fall into that bucket. So apologies at large. That said, kind of pivoting to the sound, your assumption that there was going to be energy throughout, I think that proved to be true. I think this record, to start talking about the sound, I don't think I could say enough positive things about the overall energy at which the record carries itself. Pretty consistently from jump, there's a high level of energy, and you can feel that in the recording, you can feel that in the production, but you can feel that in the songwriting too. I think if there's anything that I would say has punk roots, it's that. The kind of the level of energy and pace that the record kind of goes by at has that kind of punk feeling, despite the fact that I think sound-wise, songwriting, that's about it in the punk box for me.
Yeah. I mean, the album feels super hungry to me. Like, it sounds like dudes in a room who've been working at it for a while and kind of understand that this is like a big opportunity for them and want to get it right, And I think, given their career trajectory, they did, but, you can feel kind of the pressure that they were feeling on themselves to, like, put together the best collection of songs that they could. And I think they did a really good job at it.
I know for myself, desperation in my rock band songwriting is always important. I think, when Bruce said, they say you got to stay hungry, baby, I'm just about starving tonight. I felt that, right? As the kids say, I felt that. When you hear that in songs, when you hear that in records, that's important to me. Give me your elevator pitch on this. What does Gaslight Anthem, the 59 sound like?
I mean, I actually, I hate to repeat myself, but I do think that it falls into that Bruce category. I think that it sounds like an edgier Bruce Springsteen, like coming out of a different time, with different influences. I was going to save this for later, but I actually think it colors my whole kind of perspective of this album. I really see the whole album as pastiche, and I don't even mean that as like a diss in any way, but like a pastiche meaning like they're imitating a variety of styles in like a really obvious way and like celebrating those influences, right? Like that would be like the literal definition.
Sure. Yeah. Well put. Great word.
Like they know exactly what they want to sound like. They know exactly what they're going for. They're using very, very obvious reference points. I mean, like I think they referenced Tom Petty like 4 times in this album.
If not more. Yeah. I mean, we'll get to some of the references that are very obvious in a way that even casual music listeners should be picking up on.
Yeah. But like, that's cool. I mean, like any band that, pretends not to be influenced by things are obviously lying. I mean, everybody has been listening to certain things. It colors, the way that you write songs. It's just a matter of, how much you're going to admit to those influences, right? So like, I think that the Gaslight Anthem, whoever's decision it was, in all this, was thinking to themselves like, this is what we want to sound like. This is what we want to go for. And I think they did it really well. Some people might not like, I guess, the amount of like obvious influences that are there. And I know that they've had, just, not to go too deep, too quick, but I know that they talked a lot in their press about, the comparisons to Bruce Springsteen and all that stuff. Which I think, it seems like at different points in their career, they liked it sometimes more than they liked it other times. And I totally get that, like when you're writing your own songs, you don't want to constantly be compared to, different artists.
Especially a single reference point.
Yeah. I mean, that has to get grating, I imagine. But at the same time, like the influences are definitely there, and I think that's totally okay. And I think they do a good job at it. But, that was my big feeling on it, was just like, it was a really it was a celebration of like everything they came up on and everything they were into. And I think they kind of synthesized it in a really into a great record.
I agree and disagree in a few different spots. So let me hit it. One, the Bruce Springsteen thing, I get it. But maybe this is the contrarian in me who's heard it so many times that I feel it. I think I feel it a bit in that desperation in the songwriting. The best Bruce Springsteen songs feel strained, feel pulled, feels like he's just pouring himself out. And I do hear a lot of that on this record. Musically, though, this maybe it's the production, maybe it's the time frame, maybe it's just a lot of these other things, but I'm putting this record somewhere between Jimmy Eat World and The Killers. That said, your comment on Pastiche is so on the nose, because I think these guys are referencing classic American rock and classic Americana type stuff in this way that is like, okay, we're citing things going back to the roots of rock and roll type things, as well as all the way into 90s alt rock, you know?
Yeah.
So
definitely.
That's this kind of way. And like, clearly the Springsteen thing is in there, like 100%. It's a strain of their DNA. But when I listen to the music, I go, what would this sound like? And I'll ask you this question. What would this sound like if there was a different singer on it? Would we be making the Springsteen comparisons even half as much?
That's actually a good question. I mean, part of the Springsteen thing for me too was, some of the production choices actually, like the slapback on the vocals, like meaning like the major echo effect that was going on the vocals throughout the whole album.
100%.
Like, I listened to the first song and I was like, interesting production choice, for the first song. And then it was on for the whole album, and that's Glory Days Bruce vocals, so that was one of the things where, it's not necessarily just actually how the band sounds, but it's actually, production choices that were made as well that reminded me of him, which is, I really didn't want to compare them to Bruce because I mean, same thing as you.
No,
that's
I know. I know it's so hard though, because I'm saying I don't hear the Bruce. You hear the Bruce, you hear Bruce Springsteen. Yeah. But I feel like so much of that is in the vocal, which makes sense because that's what makes that dude so unique. When we talk about the great voices of music, let's say, not just rock music, but music. Bruce Springsteen is pretty singular. He has his own thing. And there's a few tendencies that is, I thank you for calling out that production because that's dead on. Like, I wouldn't have pointed that out, but that's exactly what it is. And even in the way he has tumbling vocal pieces where it feels like the words are falling out his mouth and they're going like this, and then it leads into the next. And that's also a Bruce Springsteen thing. And he's not the only person who does that,
of course. But
his cadence leans into it. And like,
I think it's also, sorry, go ahead.
Go.
No, for me, I mean, it was also just a matter of the lyrics themselves, like I'm a big lyric guy. I think like since I was a kid, I always like pull out the lyric sheet and kind of, see what the band is all about. And that's always been a really important element of it for me. And for these guys, it was really obvious from kind of the start that, I actually didn't do my homework. I think Brian Fallon writes all the lyrics, but
yeah, I'm pretty sure.
If he doesn't, I apologize. But it seems like he writes a lot of songs from different perspectives, right? So it's not just, his life experience. He's actually trying to take, the experience of other people and, write songs from that perspective. And I think that's something that Bruce Springsteen is actually like, he's excelled at it throughout his career. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, that was something too, where, I think in the first song, there were references to his ex-wife.
Yep.
And I was like, how old is this guy? Does he have an ex-wife? Like, is this real? So like throughout the whole album, I was questioning like, what's his perspective and what's other people's perspective?
Is there anything that we could call Bruce Springsteen that hits more on the note, lyrically speaking, than an everyman storyteller? right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's very grounded. There are tangible elements that are intertwined into it that are designed for it to feel immediately relatable. I think that Mr. Fallon is pulling on the same strings and the same kind of conventions lyrically, and it works. And he's clever, and he's, you know, I wanted to hold the conversation about references, but even that, a big element, and this actually, here we go, circling back to New Jersey. I briefly lived with a fella who wrote commercials and wrote jingles. And I remember vividly sitting in my room, and he was probably 4 years older than me, which when you're 19 or 20, a 24 or 25-year-old, they might as well be 40. They feel, well, you're not my dad, but you could be like my weird uncle. But I remember him vividly playing, a Third Eye Blind song, Gin Blossoms, these weird alt-rock songs, backwards, forwards, changing one thing, full-on Milli Vanilli, like dun, 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 because, and it was something that I talked to him about. He's like, look, I won't just use this song, but what I'm trying to do or find the parts of it, the elements that I can pull or mirror or invert, that when someone hears them, it'll be immediately familiar, because people like things that are familiar. And that is something that I think plays really well on this record, especially lyrically. There's, what is the song High Lonesome, that's 2/3 of the way through the record, makes very overt references. And I mean, there's a lot, like we can go through this. It's Counting Crows, Tom Petty, Springsteen, Bob Dylan, Tom Waits, Sam Cooke, Wilson Pickett, Bob Seger, Johnny Cash, like so on, so on, so on. You can literally think about what this band, what this lyricist record collection looks like based on some of these references. But I remember in that song, High Lonesome, because I like the Counting Crows, but it's been a minute. And he pulls lyrics, the Maria came to Nashville with a suitcase in her hand, and it caught me. The song caught me in that way that I'm like, I know this. What is this? What is he talking? What is this song? And I started having to do it through my head with the rest of it. And then it clicked. I'm like, oh, Counting Crows. Okay.
I didn't even catch that one. I'm a Counting Crows fan. That's cool.
Right. Oh, and if you go, he pulls another line from the same song. So, I kind of always wish I looked like Elvis,
right.
Also in that same song. So he's pulling on these things that immediately bring the listener in. And I think that's actually a really cool thing on this record. I think it's it's not fair to call it a trick of the trade, because most people can't pull this off without it being corny. So let me start, my salvo here saying, I don't think this record is corny. And I think people who didn't listen to it, or who might be from a certain background, might think that music could be corny. And I don't think it is. I actually found it really warm, high energy. I made those comparisons. I think it's somewhere sonically, like just the songs, if you pull the vocals off, it to me could be somewhere between Jimmy Eat World and The Killers. And it makes sense when you think about the register of it. But I really enjoyed it. And I think vocally, he was doing enough on his own, too, that it wasn't just impression. It wasn't cosplay. It wasn't just homage. It was pastiche is a cool word for it, because that isn't someone could try to take that and twist that as a negative. But I'm here to tell you that when you said that, Pete, I don't hear any negative tone about it. I hear that appreciation where someone takes a lot of the things they love and repurpose and make this, sort of beautiful collage. And even more so than that, they're not gluing and taping scraps of paper here. They're putting together songs that are bringing to mind things they love. So that's, I actually was surprisingly engaged with this record. So I enjoyed it, but I was also engaged with it. And I think a few of those reasons are, one, the activity of listening to a record to talk about it, but two, because of some of this stuff like the lyrical content, I was really pulled in.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely kept me engaged. It definitely kept me wanting to know kind of what was going to come next, because I think that they did a good job of, the pastiche thing was definitely, again, it's a compliment. I mean, a million bands have tried to do what Gaslight Anthem did on this album and failed horribly, Gaslight Anthem did a really great job of taking what they love, putting it in an album, but then putting their own spin on it. And it obviously had resonance, people liked it. And even, I listened to the song, the 59 Sound, just before we started recording, just to kind of as a refresher, because I listened to the album a few days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this fucking song is catchy. This is a good song. Like, I might even come back to this, So although, I said before, even it's not in my lane, like, it's not in my lane, but like, it doesn't change the fact that these are good songs that I might put on a playlist at some point,
Right. So here's my question for you, because I probably agree. It's not something that's hitting a soft spot for me. What makes this record not in your lane? Because I have my answer, but.
So that's a really tough question to answer. It's just, I think I'll say this. Had I heard this record 10 or 15 years ago, it probably would have been in my lane. But this is just not the genre that I kind of go to at this point. It's not the kind of album that I'd listen to over and over at this point.
Right.
I think if I was 25, going to shows in New Brunswick, or like involved in the Jersey scene, or, at that point,
right.
I think I definitely could have caught wind of this and like been a Gaslight Anthem super fan. But we were ships passing in the night. It's not for me at this moment, I guess I should say. I could definitely see myself getting into it further at different eras of my life.
So I cited that this isn't corny. I actually appreciate the sound, etc. The productions are a little clean for me for this style of stuff, but that's like a personal preference. When I listen to this, I'm like, this is great. This is a cool record. I typically gravitate to stuff that's a little grittier. But that said, I could see myself going back to this, and I plan to, because I want this exercise to, especially when, look, we're going to do a lot of episodes where we're very familiar with the music, but this one we wanted to do something that we're not. So with this, I was pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed it, and it's definitely not something that would be in my go-to. However, the quality of it is like really impressive. I have a few questions for you that are a little off script. You ready?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go for it.
So we noted Springsteen. You say Gaslight Anthem, 59 Sound. Oh, like Bruce Springsteen for now. The other thing I heard.
That has to suck to hear. So,
It has to suck. It's.
I feel for him.
I feel for them too, and it's so. Anyways, I think they've done very well, and I think they're plenty fine. They don't need us to say, "Hey, we feel bad that you get compared to Bruce Springsteen." They probably go, "Yo, it's actually pretty fine, man. Don't worry."
Yeah.
The other thing
depending on the interview, I've read a bunch of interviews, and depending on the era, I think they have different answers. Where like sometimes they're really grateful for it, and other times they're like, "Fucking calm down about the Bruce Springsteen thing," So I totally get it.
Yeah. So the other one is Punk, and I think it's interesting. I actually I'll recommend to people who are listening to this, because they love the Gaslight Anthem. If you haven't read it, The Ringer, Robert Mays wrote a really good oral history. Put together a really good oral history, maybe we should say, on the 59 Sound and about them leading up and doing the recording, all that fun stuff. And it really paints them as this like punk band. And it's my understanding of that term is a little different. However, in the way that the oral history is framed, I'm like, okay, I see what you're going for. This was a band who was making no money. This was a band who was playing to, sometimes 20 people when they'd go tour. I think that's a reality a lot of people don't always know, is that for a rock band, anytime, really anytime, but especially in the modern era, if you're going on tour and not a lot of people know you and you aren't necessarily part of some deeply niche subgenre music scene, you don't necessarily have a built-in crowd. So if you play to 20 people in Jacksonville, you're grateful for those 20 people. So I think that was a really well done history, but it kind of kept going punk, 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 punk. The record is released on Side One Dummy, which is, for lack of a better term, a punk record label. They've done records for Flogging Molly, the band Title Fight, if someone's familiar, a lot of different stuff. You could put them loosely in the same world as something like Epitaph, or that's probably a good comparison for someone who's not as familiar. The guys who started that label, Joe Sib and Bill Armstrong. Joe Sib was in a couple of punk bands, Wax, and then he was in a band I was more familiar with, 22 Jacks. So that said, is this a punk record to you?
No. The influences are obviously there, like when you say that it's, it sounds like Jimmy Eat World, somewhere between Jimmy Eat World and the Killers to you. For me, I take that kind of further into the punk world, where I would say it sounds like something between like Hot Order Music and like early Foo Fighters.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that's I think we're shining
because I do
flashlights. That's good.
Yeah, definitely. But like, I feel like when I think Jimmy Eat World, I think like super production, and when I think Killers, I think like high production. So like for me, it's like bring it down a notch a little bit in terms of that,
Sure.
But that being said, I think the spirit. In spirit, it's a punk record. In sound, it is not a punk record. In sound, it's more of like a rock and roll record, essentially.
Yeah, I say it's not a punk record, and I mean that in the best possible way, because I don't want to disparage it. Or, here's the thing: I feel like I could give this to my mom, and she might be able to enjoy it. But if I was like, hey, check out this punk record, a lot of people might not be able to.
Is that how you pitch music to your mom?
Whenever I'm giving my mom records, yeah, no. I buy her the James Taylor Christmas CD, and she's happy.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
This is not punk musically to me. There's a little bit of that energy. We talked about desperation. We talked about how high energy it feels. Like it's an up-tempo record. And it really doesn't come down too hard ever. And I'm very curious about their follow-up, because I'm curious if they're like, all right, guys, let's change it up. Let's kind of add some flavor here. Just kind of speculation as I haven't heard this, but that's often how it goes. This record feels a lot like a soft alt, post grunge Americana rock record to me.
Yeah.
I think all the references, all the citations they make show that these are really deep music fans. These are guys who went to the school of music and really were into it and really like a lot of different stuff, as kind of noted. And they're probably coming from the punk world. And if that's anything that I was taught from getting into music through a more underground subculture world, was it made me appreciate music at large much more. So I think that's kind of thing. And like, if you were to put the Gaslight Anthem into a genre, rock and roll is the one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I'm actually looking through my notes right now too. And like some of the references, like Miles Davis, there were so many, going on. It's just, it's such deep, you said it, but American rock record. Like it's very, very, very American, which I think is actually an interesting distinction, because there's like zero European influence, and that's where I think too, like with the Bruce Springsteen thing, like I think one of the reasons that Bruce Springsteen is so admired internationally is because it's so American. Like it's not something that can come from Spain. It's not something that can come from England. It's not something that can come from, anywhere else. And I think that based on what I read, at least, Gaslight Anthem have found that same sort of kind of international fanfare. And I think that same rule applies there, right? Where it's like, it's so like specifically American and intentionally American, where, I think that's cool. I mean, they did a good job with it.
I think it's really cool. And you saying that made me think, one, the prevalence of Britpop as an influence on music of the last 15 or 20 years. It's
right.
Britpop of the 90s. And then if you go to like the big British music scenes of the 80s that have just like super saturated almost everything subculturally here.
Right.
From the indie rock to new wave to no wave to fucking dance music to everything. There's a lot of that British influence. But it made me think of the fact that this is kind of an up-tempo record. They could have gone Clash on this really easily, and they don't.
Yeah.
And that song is a reference. I'd say, they tread that line and don't go there in a way that I would almost ask them, like, did you have to intentionally lean away from certain, structures or like, tricks of the trade to stay away from that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you said you're curious about the next record, and I said I'm curious about the first record. It's interesting to listen to this album kind of in a vacuum, without that context, because for all I know, the first record sounds like the Clash, and then they kind of pared it back a little bit, and the next record sounds like the Killers. Like I have no idea, right? But right. I'm definitely curious to see where they took that, because it does seem like, the reason we chose this record is because apparently this is like the album, right? So yeah, so it's curious to me, like, what about this was like the perfect kind of pairing of those things, like they took a bit of punk, they took a bit of rock, they took a bit of Americana, and they kind of combined it perfectly. So yeah.
I have another question here. I promise there's not too many.
No, it's fine. Go for it.
If you're going by age and thinking about, who are the rock bands who were supposed to be the next big thing in the early 2000s, the early part of 2000 to 2005? The Strokes, that whole kind of wave of
all of the bands,
the bands, yeah, the Bravery, the Stills, the Kills, the Bravery, all that stuff.
The Vines, yeah.
Yep. Yes. This kind of lo-fi ink, for lack of a better term. It's like, we have major label budgets and are working in big studios, but we're going to make it sound like we recorded in our garage. We're going to make this sound like a late 70s power pop thing, or try. But after that ship came and went, I don't know. I mean, this record never got the love that something like Is This It got, or anything from that early era in a public way. But I think that there might have been a craving for something different or something new to come along in terms of a rock record that's palatable to a larger audience. Do you think this could have filled that void for a lot of people who are looking for something that they could appreciate, that was now, but that also had that kind of nostalgia vibe, these kind of references, stuff that made it feel really familiar?
So had this come out, just so I understand correctly, kind of at that time?
No, this comes out in the wave. This comes out, 2008 or 2009? I believe 2009.
Yeah, I think 2000, yeah.
2009. 2008, correct. To correct myself. Summer 2008. did this come out in a way like for people who had gone through this stuff, people who like guitar music, people who like rock music, but aren't necessarily knee deep in some subgenre? So they're the casual listener, you know?
Right.
Could this have been something that felt fresh and new to them, given what had just gone through, for lack of a better term, mainstream rock music for the past decade before it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you think about that.
I definitely think so. I mean, I think that I love the Strokes. At least let me actually clarify. I love the first Strokes album. Aside
It's
from
fantastic.
that,
It's just a very good record. It's a great record.
Yeah.
You know, so.
It's a great record. But that being said, it's really unemotional. It's totally detached. It's like alcoholic cocaine addict music, where like it's just like you're so deep in whatever your vice is that you actually like have no feeling for other people. Like that's actually like what that album sounds like to me, and it's in the best way. Like, I mean, it's like in the spirit of like the Velvet Underground, where, you know, I'm not sure that Lou Reed really gave a shit about anybody, right? And I think that like shows through in music. But that being said, like too much of that stuff and too much of that sort of like too cool for school like vibe will definitely get tired. And I think that by the time this album comes along, that stuff was pretty tired. And, you know, there's definitely, you know, more of an emotional, like there's more of a human feel to this album, where it's like the guy's wearing his heart on his sleeve, regardless of whether he's making references that are his own or taking the perspective of other people. Like you feel that, you know, and you I don't know. Regardless of whether you even relate to it, like you can probably sing along to it and have a good time with it, you know? So, I think it definitely probably filled a void like that. And whether you came from punk or not, you know, I think that it was something that was lacking in rock music at the time, I imagine.
Yeah, I think there's a lack of pretense with this, and I should use this as a way to circle back to my comments of like my presumptions that there was an element of cosplay or like, fucking Fonzie dress up shit here.
Yeah.
When you actually listen to the music, you can see why so many people really, really attach themselves, not just to this band, but this record specifically, because it lacks pretense. It feels very emotional. It feels pretty vulnerable. It feels very hard on the sleeve. And I think that that's something people appreciate, especially in rock music. Now, it doesn't mean it always lands. Just in the same way as people appreciate actual human emotion, if someone is bawling their eyes out, many people's first instinct is to look away or get out of the room. You know what I mean? So that's a line that has to be tread lightly. And I think they did very well on this record, because the other side of this to me is when something comes off as too emotional or too vulnerable or too much whatever, and they don't go there. But in the same, like, I also really appreciate that first Strokes record, but it is distant and it feels removed and detached. And, you know, a critic could say aloof, but that could be said for lots of great things. So I'm not mad at that. I do think this felt like a breath of fresh air, and I'm surprised that it didn't get bigger, if I can be totally honest. Like, I actually, when I listen to this, I go, oh, this feels like it hits a lot of chords that could have gone very big at different points in time. And make no mistake, this band's done very well for themselves. I'm sure more than a couple houses have been bought and sold on the backs of this recording and their work as a band. So kudos, much praise. But at the same time, this is a band who it's like, wow, they feel like they could have been even bigger if they hit at the right exact moment, you know?
Yeah.
This is an album, by the way. There's a couple singles for sure, but you can listen to this whole record straight through and not feel like, all right, skip, eject.
Absolutely. It's definitely an album. I mean, like, one of the things, you know, taking a step back, you know, the premise for this entire podcast is because I think, you know, I'm an album guy. You're an album guy. We both appreciate albums. We appreciate the way that songs are structured and, you know, their placement and the way that they're placed together and why they're placed together that way. These guys very clearly appreciate that as well. You know, you listen to a lot of albums nowadays, and a lot of the time I look at my watch and I'm like, fuck, like there's like 10 songs left. I'm on song 9, you know, like what is going on? And why is this song an hour and a half, or why is this album an hour and a half long? Right. You know?
Yeah. It's like, we're just going to take as many stabs at this as we can. 19 songs. Sure. Hopefully we get 3 hits.
Right. Exactly. We're bound to make a Spotify playlist with like 25 songs on this album. But yeah, I mean, this as an album, it was really well played, you know?
Okay. Question.
Yeah.
Who is the target demographic for this record? And that's to say, to the uninitiated, target demographic, the people that this record is for. Because I think this is a fun question. Go ahead.
And again, I don't mean this with any mean spirit whatsoever. I think it's for anyone in their 20s who is curious about music and curious about literature. There are a lot of literary references here. There are a lot of, you know, like deep historic musical references here. I think, you know, you obviously have to have some interest in rock and roll. But I think that it's one of those albums that you can go back to and you're going to catch references over and over.
Absolutely.
You know, like there was a Tom Robbins reference, even Cowgirls Got the Blues, right? Like that might be a song for someone initially, and then they're like, oh, that was a Tom Robbins book. I'm going to read that book, you know, and then it brings them into this whole other world from there, you know? So, I think it's definitely like candy for the curious listener. If you're looking to get references out of that. And I say people in their 20s, which is, you know, again, I don't mean to diss anybody. It's just, I feel like people are generally more curious in their 20s than they are in their, you know, teens or 30s, you know.
That's such a shame. I would say, because I agree with you. It's just to pull it out to that. It's such a shame because losing curiosity is a sign of something. It's a sign of boredom, or lack of interest, and that's such a shame. I think I would extend this. I think for somebody in their 20s, for sure, you should hear this record, and it probably speaks to you. If you go to a small college town, you will definitely appreciate this. If you are a bored teen or 20-something in suburbia, you will certainly appreciate this. I would also extend this to people in their 30s who are looking for something new, and they like rock music, and they just need something new with a little bit of get up and go for them because of all those references we're talking about. I do think that Tom Petty references might be lost on most people under the age of 35. I do think that even beyond that, like Bob Seger, Bob Dylan, you know, all these other things are going to be lost on some people. But for those people who it is, this might be a thrill. Additionally, people who are into American rock music should hear this, and people who are curious about it, and that could be kind of anyone. I thought this was a very broad appeal record, and there's going to be plenty of people who it's like, oh, that was cool, I'm good. But there might be some people who haven't heard this record who really attach themselves to it.
Yeah, for sure. I thought to myself too, while I was listening to it, that a big distinction for me with music has always been how it's done live. And I was reading a lot about them, you know, at the time and how they were playing. And I read, I think that the tour, actually, the initial tour for this album was them opening up for the Alkaline Trio, Rise Against, and Thrice. So they were first on a 4-band bill, which, you know, just so everyone understands, nobody sees your band when you play first on a 4-band bill, especially a bill that stacked, right? Like where I know that Rise Against were big at the time. I know that Alkaline Trio were big at the time. I know that Thrice were big at the time. You know, I know that Gaslight Anthem were hyped, but they hadn't like reached that crest yet, right? So like, and apparently, you know, like the stories that that I was reading about, one of the Alkaline Trio guys went up to one of the Gaslight Anthem guys in the band at the time and was like, "Hey, down the road, will you guys take us on tour?" which to me like signifies like they were going at it so hard and like so hungry that those other like more established bands at the time kind of recognized that like this band is going to take us over. It's only a matter of time, you know.
Which is impressive to say, and exactly what you said about this. You're the opening band on a 4-band bill of that caliber playing that size venues. You're likely playing, you know, I want to say 30 minutes after doors, but we'll be fair and say an hour after doors. And that means you're not at half capacity in most places. And
you're lucky if you're at half capacity, yeah.
And it's something that's kind of, if you are unfamiliar, there's the term opening for Slayer. There's a few bands. Now, Rise Against isn't one of those, thankfully, and like big credit to a band like that, or even bands like Thrice who do it as well. Their fans are people who tend to check out the bands who the headliner brings on tour with them. But there's other opportunities, situations like Slayer, people who go to see who went, R.I.P. Slayer, who went to see Slayer, were there to see Slayer. And your band, whatever, it could be a Slayer knockoff, it could be the best new metal band that's ever existed, it could be the best it could be anything that's incredible that these people would absolutely love, has the Slayer stamp of approval. However, doesn't matter. The people want to see Slayer, get the fuck off the stage. Major credit to a band like Gaslight Anthem doing that, because that's, you know, I think it's interesting to think about their journey, because this is a band who was doing the, hey, we're touring and playing to almost nobody, but we're trying to go at it. And from what I understand, it was that attitude and energy put into the live show that kind of got them really put on radar for Side One Dummy, which obviously led to the release of this record.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
and it's one of those things that makes me think to myself, like, you know, I wish that I had seen them at that time, because it would put it in a different context for me, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely is. So, okay. What I would ask you is, are there any records that you would recommend? So we said who we would recommend this record to. Are there any records that if somebody who's listening to this who already loves Gaslight Anthem, is there a specific record or band you would recommend for them to check out if they heard and love Gaslight Anthem? Hey, if you like this, you should check out this.
It's not a direct connection, but the first thing that came to my mind is Hot Water Music.
I was going to say, you mentioned them. I think that's it's not analogous musically, but I think if you like this record, you should check out Hot Water Music. Yeah,
it comes from, actually, I mean, it comes from a similar world. I think the influencers are different, but I think that a lot of the feel of it, the lyrics, kind of the emotional, the emotional parts of it are similar.
Right.
I think that someone could definitely appreciate it. Specifically, I would recommend maybe Caution or A Flight and a Crash. I think people would like if they like this album.
And I would note that Chris Woolard, who's also in Hot Water Music, did some additional vocals on this record, and I think he was involved a little more than that as well. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
did you know that Dickie Barrett did guest vocals?
I did.
On this?
That was one of the funny little pickups. Like, that's a voice that's kind of unmistakable too. So,
I heard that voice and I had to I went immediately into the credits and was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's it.
So that's the 59 sound. You got anything else on it?
I think I'm good. I did think that it was interesting how they, again, like it took about a year for them to really get recognized for the album. And it wasn't until kind of Hyde Park and Glastonbury when they had that actual Bruce experience where Bruce played a song with them and Brian Fallon played a song with Bruce.
And all of a sudden the record doubles in sales like that, like basically.
Record blows up, everything's crazy. I mean, it's just, it's one of those things where, again, like, I hate to be that on the nose about the influences, and I hate to even give credit to Bruce for their success because it's definitely deserved regardless, but I think that, it's little moments like that are interesting, where, like, it would have been a shame if this album had been, just swept under the rug and like not recognized at the time. So had things played out differently, I'm curious, what the trajectory would have been.
Agree. So 2 questions that I brought up on the episode 0. Is this record good? Is this well played?
Yes,
well put
undoubtedly.
Undoubtedly. Like you can't. Everything very solid.
No, I mean, listen, you could be a total hater and like you can't deny that this is like even if you think it's a bad genre, it's the best of a bad genre. I mean, like I don't care what your critique might be. I think they're definitely very good at what they do because a million bands have tried to do this and not many of them succeed, and I think they definitely succeeded.
Absolutely. And did you like this?
Yeah.
Me too. I was
very
pleasantly surprised. Not surprised. Surprise is the wrong word. And it's not fair. I was not sure, and I was happy. I'm happy to report I enjoyed this record.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it accomplished everything it set out to do. I think that it was a really good record, start to finish. I think that it made me ask questions, which is something that an album kind of rarely does, right? Where it's like, I wonder what the album before this sounds like, and I wonder what they did after. Like, it's definitely a band that had potential, and it made me curious about that. Which, like, dude, I mean, most bands, you hear a song, and you're like, do I want to see what comes next?
Right.
So
it's a sink or swim on one song. And
yeah, so to sit through like a 40 minute album and like really think about, like what they've done and where they're going, they definitely, it's a good album. They accomplished what they set out to do, I think.
Give is that if you listen to it, you went, oh, I wonder what everything else sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
So with that said, 59 Sound, we're with you. The Gaslight Anthem, and we'll kind of, who knows, this may or may not be our final stamp on this. Maybe we'll revisit this conversation here, there, or sometime else. For now,
for sure, there are a lot of Gaslight Anthem albums, so we'll see.
That's true. For now, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are we doing for our next record? So
I think that, I'm thinking of eras. I'm thinking of decades. We just did Gaslight Anthem. That's obviously the 2000s.
Yep.
Going into the 2010s. Maybe we bring it back to the 90s because that's, an era that both of us kind of grew up in.
Sure
and are familiar with too.
Sure did.
What if we talk about the band Monster Magnet?
Oh, wow. Okay. Let's do it.
I think that for the deep heads, the album would be Spine of God, but I think we can cover that at a later date. I think we should go with the bigger album, which was Dopes to Infinity.
Yeah. Okay. I think Dopes to Infinity is the way to go.
Yeah.
All right. So leading into this, Monster Magnet, a hard rock, kind of not space rock, but like heavy.
Definitely. I think they would. I think they would prefer to be called space rock, and I think that's probably. Yeah.
What's fantastic on this is some of the references. For my peeps out there who enjoy comic books, the second song is called Negasonic Teenage Warhead. I'll discuss that next week a bit. This is a big band, sort of locals to the Jersey Shore, which is fucking cool. And I think it's completely overlooked, but it hits our wheelhouse. I think this is one that has a lot of opportunity, and it's been a minute. I've heard this record many times, but it's been a while, so I'm excited to dive back in.
Yeah, I'm a fan, but to be honest, this was never my go-to. My go-to, I heard them initially through Beavis and Butthead, which I think was a lot of people's first introductions to them, probably.
Yeah.
But then, I was always a big fan of Super Judge and Spine of God, which are the first two albums.
Yeah, Super Judge is the one I think of. When I picture a record in my head, it's Super Judge. But why don't we do Dopes to Infinity? I think that might be the easiest in for this band, maybe?
I think that's where we start, for sure. Yeah.
Fuck yeah, I'm excited about this. All right, so...
Cool.
Everyone, thank you for checking us out. Pete, I think we have socials and an email. Is that correct?
We do. It is at It Came From NJ Pod on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can find us.
And the email is?
Email is itcamefromnjpod@gmail.com.
Feel free to shoot us a line any of those places. Throw us a follow. We'll try to make it interesting and fun. And yeah, the more you engage, the more we'll be able to have deeper conversations. That's kind of what we're here for. Pete?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we'd love to be hearing from, everyone out there on anything that you guys would like us to talk about, because ultimately, there are only so many albums from New Jersey. There are a lot of them, but, obviously we want to be talking about what you guys are curious about hearing. So let us know.
All right. Thanks, Pete. We'll talk soon.
Okay.